Do you see my screen or my the presentation on my screen?
We can see the presentation.
Okay, so it's fine. You see just one big window white with payments for ecosystem services. Or
And
no?
We also see the second one.
Okay, now it should see the presentation fine.
Yes, now it's just the first one.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for this little mess. So today we talk about payments for ecosystem services, which is an application of the concept of ecosystem services that Laura Grecchi already told you in this lecture, which was focused on the Life Vimine project. You know that, as I told you, ecosystems can provide several benefits, concrete benefits to people, to humans, which we collectively call ecosystem services. An example, which is familiar to you as future environmental engineers, is the capability of wetlands to purify water. Wetland can naturally clean water from nutrients and even synthetic pollutants through processes such as nitrification and denitrification, algal uptake, absorption to sediments, absorption to plant roots, and microbic activity, and so on. That's an ecosystem services, because without the capability of water bodies and wetlands in particular of purifying water, we would need more water treatment plants. So as Laura told you, we come to realize that protecting ecosystems is important, not just because of ethical reasons, because of protection of biodiversity in itself, protection of nature, but also because of utilitarian reason. We need the services provided by ecosystems. So by protecting ecosystems, we protect also their services. There are several methods through which we can protect services provided by ecosystems. And they are, of course, regulations and legislation. For example, we've seen the Natura 2000 network. So the establishment of protected areas by law is such a mean. Or sorry, people keep coming, so I'm letting them in. But of course, information and communication, point 3 here is also very important. So you should communicate, raise awareness of the importance of ecosystem services, so that we make people more aware of the importance of respecting nature. And it is much more than that. Recent European policies dealing with the environment, dealing, for example, with water quality, floods, with biodiversity, all focus on the importance of engaging stakeholders in decision-making, also when we deal with engineering projects. An example is the public participation phase in the environmental impact assessment procedure. But in general, stakeholder engagement is important. And by stakeholders, we mean any actor who has an interest in a certain topic, in our case, environment. And there's a third way, point 2 here, and which is what we will talk about today, which are market-based tools to protect ecosystem services, such as eco-taxes, carbon taxes, subsidies, and payment for ecosystem services is such a type of market-based tool. So what are payment for ecosystem services? PES for short. They are an economic tool which has the goal to maintain, so to protect or even increase the provision of services by ecosystems. In the slides, you will see that ESS means ecosystem services. And why such a tool was developed? It was developed because you know that ecosystems provide to us as humans several ecosystem services at no cost, but of course human actions, including human environmental management, can influence the level of such provision in a positive or negative manner. And the problem with ecosystem services, one problem with ecosystem services is that usually they are not considered in the making. They are externalities, meaning that when somebody, according to our current legislation, usually when somebody damages an ecosystem, and in particular, this actor damages the services that this ecosystem provides to us, is not paying for the damages created. So the damage is an externality in the cost that that actor incurs. Yeah. So the goal of the payment for ecosystem service schemes is to create a market, a financial market, so they are financial tools for those system services that are ignoring decision making exactly because they are provided for free and so nobody is paying for them. In practice, let me make an example. A payment for ecosystem services is a market tool through which a subject, an actor who benefits an ecosystem service, pay the suppliers of that service to ensure that that service is provided. For example, think about farmers. Think about ditches in agricultural fields. Ditches are fossi in England. When a farmer maintain the proper depth and section of the ditch alongside the agricultural field, the ditch is able to capture stormwater. The ditch is capable of infiltrating stormwater and recharging the underground aquifer, the groundwater. The ditch is a small treatment wetland, so it purifies water. The ditch is an ecological corridor and through which species can migrate, so it supports biodiversity. All of these things, stormwater control, groundwater infiltration, treatment of water, biodiversity support, they are ecosystem services. So in this country, in this region, there are incentives to farmers for maintaining ditches because they provide benefits not just to the farmers, not to the farmers in particular, but to our whole society because this region is prone to flooding, for example. And that's an example. Incentives are actually an example of a payment for ecosystem service scheme. The people who benefit from the ditches, this is our society who benefit from the capability of store water, so we are not flooded when it rains, pay through the Veneto region, in this case, farmers to maintain this. This is in the Piano Sviluppo Rurale, PSR, of the Veneto, in the Veneto region. So when you put into place such a payment for ecosystem service scheme agreement, who are the actors? Of course, there has to be a buyer, somebody who pays money for maintaining the ecosystem services, which is the subject of the agreement. For example, such buyer could be companies. We'll make an example about New York in another slide, or public bodies such as the Veneto region acting on behalf of the communities they represent. Usually the buyer is the beneficiary, although it's not always the same. So in the case of the Veneto region is the buyer, but the beneficiary is the whole population of the Veneto, which is something different from the government of the Veneto region. Then you have a seller, so also called supplier, provider. The person or the actor or the company, whatever, the subject who gets paid, who gets an incentive to maintain the ecosystem service provision. So for example, it would be more easy for the farmer to not to maintain the ditch and spend his time doing something else or plant some crops on the surface covered by the ditch. But that would be less sustainable for us as a society. So, and there comes the payment for ecosystem service scheme into account. So example of suppliers are landscape or resource managers, or typically landowners such as farmers or forest owners, as we see in a moment. And then in PES schemes, you can also have intermediaries, people who, especially because this kind of schemes are quite new, they help buyers and sellers to develop a fair and effective payment for ecosystem service schemes. You can think of this as consultants. Okay, today this is just another definition, but let's focus on the sentence at the bottom of the slide. These PES schemes are rarely applied to marine and coastal ecosystems today. I'll also talk about an example in coastal ecosystems. So this is why it's a relevant example, I think. So, what's the structure of a payment for ecosystem service scheme? Of course, a precondition that you have at least one buyer and at least one provider for that ecosystem service, because there has to be an agreement between them. The agreement must be explicit, of course, clear and voluntary. So the provider must be free to choose how to use the resource. If is not free to choose, but there's some kind of compulsory action on his side, then it's not a payment for ecosystem scheme, it's something else. You have to think that these kinds of agreement have been much used in the case of the conservation of tropical forests, okay? And then the political situation can be quite different from here. So this voluntary thing is important in all contexts, but think about those contexts even more. And measurability is also a precondition. So when you make a payment for ecosystem service agreement, the service, that's the focus of the agreement, should be measurable, because only if something is measurable, you can verify that the agreement is working. This is trivial, okay, but it's fundamental to develop proper and fair and effective payment system. And conditionality of payment, which descends from the previous point. Payment, of course, is made only if the ecosystem service can be maintained and is actually maintained and provided regularly. If the provider fails to provide ecosystem service, payment does not take place, and this can only be verified as per point 3, if the ecosystem service is measurable. This we skip. So an example about this is about water supply in New York. In New York City, there has been an agreement between the company, the private company in charge of supplying water to New York City, and the owners of forested areas which are upstream of New York City within the catchment basin of the water bodies from which New York City take water from. So this agreement, ecosystem service, which is the subject of this agreement, is water provision, of course. And what's the focus of this agreement? The owner of the forest, when that are upstream of New York, they implement forest management practices which are sustainable and which ensure that the water that comes downstream and gets to New York City is constant in terms of quality and quantity. And as a compensation, they get paid a small fee, which is found in the water tax of New York City. So basically, people in New York City pay forest owners upstream for maintaining forests in a way such that water supply is possible to New York City. This led to overall savings for people in New York City, because instead of constructing wastewater treatment plants, which would have been much more expensive and would have been paid by the city, and so by them through the water tax anyway, they are paying a much smaller fee to forest owners, and so exploiting the effectiveness of this ecosystem service provision and also the cost effectiveness of this ecosystem service provision. And so they spend less, city citizens, and the forest owners get a regular annual fee, annual income for the effort in maintaining the forest. So it's a sort of win-win situation. So this is an example from New York, and I would like to tell you about a simple example of the work we are currently making in the context of the project of the regional collaboration between Italy and Slovenia, which is called EcoSmart. And what this project is trying to do is to develop a model for managing Natura 2000 sites in the context of climate change, and in particular to develop economic tools to fund the conservation actions needed to contrast climate change. The climate change in the Mediterranean region is already and is going to be particularly harsh, not just because of the warming that are already experiencing with these mild winters and hot summers, but also because forecasts tell us that we'll have more extreme weather events, more floodings, more storms, more droughts, so periods of dry weather. This will also increase saltwater intrusion in coastal areas, the saline wedge. And so the question is, can we adapt the complex territories we live in, especially coastal territories, that is the focus of EcoSmart, to climate change, which are unavoidable regardless of the emission management scenarios we take into account. So the goal of this project was to find measures capable of promoting socioeconomic development in the context of climate change, and at the same time promoting nature conservation. And based on what Laura Grechi told you, that ecosystem services are just a point of contact between nature and between the socioeconomic system. So of course, ecosystem services will be the topic of this project, which is some short data led by the Veneto region. It has several partners from Italy, Veneto, and Friuli Venezia Giulia, and Slovenia. And it's an ongoing project. It's a pilot project. So it's a project which is in between research and application. And it aims to assess the climate vulnerability of Natura 2000 sites in the coast of Italy and Slovenia, and to test the economic feasibility of funding biodiversity protection actions in Italy and Slovenia through the application of payment for ecosystem services schemes. So it's a pilot project. So it tried to demonstrate that these payment for ecosystem services schemes are feasible manners, cost-effective manners, sustainable manners to fund biodiversity protection in Natura 2000 sites. And So what we'll talk about today is three things. One is we talk about the ecosystem services identification in this Natura 2000 area. We'll then briefly talk about how we can assess their vulnerability to climate change, and we finally look at the payment for ecosystem services scheme. And although the project focuses on Veneto, Friuli, Venezia Giulia, and Slovenia, we focus only on Veneto today, and in particular on 3 Natura 2000 sites that are found in the area that you see circled in the map. So the Caorle Lagoon, the mouth of the Tagliamento River, and Valle Vecchia and Bibbione Zumelle. Those EAT 3, 2, and other numbers are the Natura 2000 codes of the 3 sites. These 3 Natura 2000 sites are coastal sites, of course. They are the dashed areas that you see in the circle. They are rich with biodiversity. They contain dune habitats. They contain coastal wetlands. They contain salt marshes, mudflats, hunting and fishing farms, the so-called Valli da Pesca, and estuaries. So they are very productive and rich with biodiversity environments. But the nearby mainland, la terraferma, is very intensely urbanized. There is tourism, for example, in Bibbione, and there is agriculture ongoing on reclaimed land, Terra di Bonifica. This is the site. You see, let me take the pointer. Yes. This here is Valle Vecchia, okay, which is a reclaimed area, and this beach here is one of the most beautiful northern Adriatic Italian beaches. It's completely natural, and it's a Natura 2000 site. This is the Caorle Lagoon, and yeah, and here you have Bibbione and Vignano. And so, and yes, let me delete. Good. Okay. So So there are many Natura 2000 habitats in these Natura 2000 sites. Of course, those are just the codes of the habitats that you can find in the Habitats Directive. But these 2 pictures are just sample. You can have pine forests growing upon old dunes. You can have more recent dunes. You can have so many habitats, which are very important from a biodiversity perspective in these sites. So the first step in the that I'm showing you, which is a subset, of course, of the activities of the project, was to identify the ecosystem services found in these Natura 2000 sites. We did this through a questionnaire. The table you see there is just an example. So we administered a survey to local stakeholders, and we also involved local experts of the sites to identify which ecosystem services were present. So what we did basically was to take a checklist, to take the list of all possible ecosystem services provided by ecosystem by CISES, the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, and these are the one you see here. So the one you see here, this is the classification. You see there's a code, and then we ask the stakeholder, is this ecosystem present in the area, yes or no? And we ask them to describe the service. we ask them to rate the ecosystem service. Is it important or not for the area? Is the stakeholder who has an interest in this ecosystem service? And yeah, why we also need to know who the stakeholders are, because if you want to develop a payment for ecosystem service scheme, you need to know who has an economic interest or a social interest in these services. So the second step is vulnerability assessment. So again, we involved stakeholder in this process, which was a part of, again, a questionnaire. So we identified possible hazards due to climate change, such as temperature increase, saltwater intrusion, and so on. Those that you see, perhaps don't see very well here, increase of heat peaks, of heat waves, increase of frequency of heat waves, increase of duration of heat waves, anoxia and hypoxia, increase in coastal water level, and so on. And for each of these hazards, we asked experts of the site to tell us if that hazard was going to have an impact on the habitats found, for example, in the site of Laguna di Caorle, so on the 6210, on habitat 2130, and so on. And then we also asked them the experts to list in this column the ecosystem services provided by each habitat here. So we mapped the impact of hazards, climate-related hazards on habitats, and we mapped habitats onto ecosystem services. And so the hazards, we identify them. So by hazards, we mean the processes through which climate change could impact the Natura 2000 sites. We identify them by reading the most recent reports by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and also by involving local experts, because you know that climate change can have effects which are different on regional and on local scales. So we came up with a list of hazards, which are the ones you see at the bottom of this slide. So temperature rise, increased duration of heat waves, increase in average water level, changing currents, variation in rainfall abundance, and so on. And this is an example of the mapping that we did for the Caorle Lagoon mouth of Mento River Natura 2000 site. For each habitat, we have a list of hazards that potentially can impact, that according to experts in our review of literature, can impact it. For example, we see that the habitat, coastal dunes, this habitat here, that I'm indicating with this blue arrow, not very nicely, but okay. Coastal dunes are impacted by the colors map to the hazards. So this one is increase in tidal range. So increase in tidal range, increase in high tide level, of course, can impact coastal dunes because it's going to submerge them. And so we see that there are habitats that are impacted by many hazards and habitats that are impacted by a few or no hazards by this analysis. So this was a qualitative analysis. Of course, it's been much more important to go quantitative and assign a weight to the impacts, but this is very complicated to do. But this analysis was a way to prepare to understand which habitats are more vulnerable to climate change because they're impacted in many different manners. A very, by definition, simplified analysis. And after this, we produce maps like this one. This is just an example where we have hazards. You see, here you have hazards, and lines indicate that this hazard increasing water level, you see, has an impact on the habitat, coastal dunes, for example. And coastal dunes provide services indicated by these arrows, such as the maintaining nursery habitats for dune plants, of course. They can be enjoyed by tourists, so they enable aesthetic experiences. This is also spiritual ecosystem services, as Laura told you. And they also control erosion rate. This is particularly important because as we see dunes represent barriers that protect mainland from the strength of storms, from the power of storms. So let me go on. And so based on the previous mapping, we were able also to understand which ecosystem services are impacted by many different hazards. This plot shows this. So for example, the ecosystem service of maintaining nursery population and habitats is impacted by many different hazards. You see. Of course, again, it will be important to be quantitative. This is just a qualitative analysis. And so based on this analysis that just simply listed without going into the detail, we decided to focus on dune habitats, on dune systems in the 3 Natura 2000 sites at Una di Caorle, Foce del Tagliamento, and Valle Vecchia, to propose a PES scheme, a payment for ecosystem service scheme. Dune systems provide many ecosystem services, which are listed here. The most interesting one to us is erosion control, as I was saying. When you have a stretch of dunes along a coast, those dunes represent a natural barrier against, let me make an example, against the strength of the sea storm. For example, this red line represents the dunes along the stretching of the dunes along the coast of Valencia. So when there is a storm, these dunes, which are, their elevation is some meters, okay, not so many, but meters, they represent a barrier against the strength of the sea, and so they protect these agricultural fields. These agricultural fields belong managed by Veneto Agricoltura, which carries out experimental agricultural activities, but they grow crops there that they are, so there is economic activities going on here. In the case of Bibbione, these dunes are those ones here. Here you have concrete protection, so you don't need to focus on these dunes for the payment for ecosystem service scheme, but where you see the red line, you have dunes, and they protect agricultural fields, which are here. And agricultural fields represent, are related, of course, to economic activities. So protecting the dunes means also protecting those economic activities. Also, you may know that in several sites of the Veneto region, every year nourishment is carried out. Nourishment, which is ripascimento in Italian, means that sand is brought to the beaches to reconstruct them, because coastal erosion keeps on destroying those beaches. For example, if you look here, if you look Google photos of this stretch of beach here, you will see that there's been erosion going on over the past decades. Dunes also protect the cost from coastal erosion. And so instead of spending money in coastal erosion, you can spend money into dune conservation to achieve the same objective. So what we did to understand if our payment for ecosystem service scheme was effective was to perform a cost-benefit analysis. And so first thing we calculated the cost of conserving, so protecting the existing dunes, and of restoring, so reconstructing dune habitats in Valle Vecchia and in Bibbione. There is an ongoing conservation project in the Adriatic coastal area, which is called Life Redune. It's a project funded with European money. And their goal is just to conserve and restore dune habitats. So they have very good data because they are doing conservation works and restoration works right now. So we asked them data and they kindly provided them those data to us. And so that's how we came up with the cost of conservation and restoration of dune habitats. Then to see if a payment for ecosystem service scheme would be cost effective, would make sense from an economic point of view, we compare these costs of conservation and restoration of dunes with the benefits with ecosystem services provided by dune habitats. We estimated those services in two different ways. You know, when you do, I think it's a good practice for engineers, when you do calculations, to try to make those calculations with different tools and see if you always come to the same conclusion. That's usually a good hint that you are reaching sound, robust conclusions. So, which are the benefits provided by dune ecosystems? A subset of those ecosystem services is avoided costs. So if you protect and restore dunes, you at the same time you protect agricultural areas from storms, and you don't need to carry out sediment nourishment, so to spend money to bring sand to reconstruct beaches. So that's avoided costs. So avoided damage to agricultural areas protected by the dunes, and avoided nourishment of sediment because dunes are there. This is a subset of all the ecosystem services. You know, like I told you, that you can estimate the value of all the ecosystem services provided by an habitat using a very simple method, which is called benefit transfer. In benefit transfer, what you do, roughly put, is that you look into the literature, find the value of ecosystem services provided by dunes in another place than the Adriatic region, and then you extrapolate those values, you use those values in the Adriatic region. So you transfer the knowledge about the benefits that you have in another region to the Adriatic Sea. And so we evaluated those ecosystem services. In the case of the benefit transfer, that I've just told you, we took data from a paper from 2012, which contains, it's a very good reference regarding values of ecosystem services provided by coastal habitats all over the world. And from that paper, we took surface-specific values of the ecosystem services provided by the habitats found in the Natura 2000 sites of Valle Vecchia and Bibbione. Those surface-specific values were expressed into international dollar per hectare per year. Sorry, that's here, just forgot to translate. And then we took official cartography of the Natura 2000 network, and we calculated the surfaces of the habitats, 0.2 here. And the ecosystem service value is simply the surface-specific value of 0.1 multiplied by the surface of 0.2. And we re-express since the paper by De Groot and colleagues was from 2012, and the value was expressed with reference to international dollar in 2007, we converted them using the rate for 2007 from dollar to euro. These are the total costs. I did not even translate them because it's difficult to understand. It's difficult to go into the detail of what we've done, but you just need to know that these are quite updated and quite good data. So to protect and restore the dunes of Valle Vecchia, it costs about €1 million per year, which may seem a lot, okay? And in the case of Bibbione, it's about €600 per year to the cost of maintaining and restoring dunes habitats there. It is a lot, but if you estimate, okay, I understand that you may think that the method of benefit transfer is just an extrapolation, so maybe you don't trust that much, but you may actually estimate avoided costs that I was telling you about that maybe look more concrete to you. So to do that, in the case of agricultural areas, we assume that in the context of climate change, there will be a strong storm every 20 years, breaking through the dune barrier if it is not protected. We assume for calculation that the interest rate is 0% simplicity. For the sake of simplicity, that's actually not a so bad assumption because you know how low interests are at this moment in time. We took the value of agricultural land from official numbers, so VAM, for those familiar with those, it's a number. This figure comes from, it's a figure used, for example, in when a public body buy private land as property. So €20 per square meter. And the Valle Vecchia dune system is 5.5 kilometers long, and it protects this agricultural area, so about 5.5 million square meters. And the dune system in Bibbione is shorter, 1.2 kilometers, and it protects an agricultural area of 1 million square meter. While for the cost, the avoiding nourishment, we took official data found on the internet by the cost bear by the Veneto region to nourish, by the Civil Engineer Corps and Civile to nourish the beaches of Bibbione in particular. And the cost is about 100 per meter of beach per year, which is not so low if you think about it. It's 1.2 kilometers. So if you make the calculation, you find that, let's start from the right. Row 1 is Valle Vecchia and row 2 these are the cost of protecting and restoring dunes that we already seen, about 1 million, about €600 per year, which may seem high, but when you look at the total benefit calculated benefit transfer, we see that the benefits provided by the Natura 2000 habitats are €32 million per year and 25 million of euro per year. Much higher than this cost. But if you don't trust this calculation, you just look at the sum of the avoided costs, so avoided nourishment, avoided damage to agriculture. The sum in the case of Valle Vecchia is about 6 million, you see, and in the case of Bibbione is about 1.1 million euro per year. If the damage to agriculture is divided by we calculate the total economic damage by multiplying this figure here by this figure here, and we consider it to take place over 20 years, so we divide it by 20. The assumption is that every 20 years, the agricultural terrain becomes unusable because the seas break the dune system, and salted terrain cannot be cultivated. And so if you make the ratio of benefit to cost, as we did here, this ratio goes from 6 to 32 in the case of Valle Vecchia, and the value of 6 is an underestimate because it takes into account only the avoided nourishment and avoided damage to agricultural cost. In the case of Bibbione, the benefit cost ratio goes from 2 to 45, where 2 is underestimated for the same reason. So the conclusion is that protecting dunes, so spending money to protect dunes, is actually a good basis for ecosystem service scheme that is sustainable, because it is much more expensive not to take care of the dunes for us as a community. So, and this is the last slide. Of course, this analysis is very simple. We are aware of the simplicity of it. It could, of course, be improved with better quality data, but I think the main message is that conserving nature is cost effective, at least in this case. And I would like to close this lecture just with a caveat about the advantages and disadvantages of the ecosystem service concept. In the calculations we did in the previous slide, there's an underlying assumption that you should always be aware of. You put a dollar sign upon ecosystem services and so upon habitats. This is not meant to suggest that if you provide enough money, habitats can be destroyed, because habitats and species should be protected also for other reasons, we believe. But this is just another reason, an additional reason why nature should be protected. And this additional reason is the value of the benefits it provides us with. Thank you. Don, is there any question? Any curiosity about this project? Something you would like to ask? Stop sharing. Stop recording. Any questions? If there is no questions, then thank you for attending this lecture, and and that's last time we meet, at least on Zoom. So thank you very much and goodbye.